Okay.
No problem.
Okay, we should be good.
Thank you. No
All
problem.
right, great.
I just muted Maria, but yeah, we're all
Thank you
set.
very much. Okay.
I
So-
can't hear Maria very well.
Me neither.
Yeah, I
Okay.
can hear that well.
I'm sorry, I'm here.
Oh,
There
that's
we go.
better. I can hear you better now.
Now it's better.
Thank you. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And I'm very thankful to have Vanessa Watson, who is a dear friend of mine and also is a partner with Able. And she is working at MasterCard as an attorney. I knew her many years prior to that, but she is here as also an ambassador for Able. And I would like to introduce her first. She's a senior managing counsel at MasterCard. She's involved in a number of other endeavors in terms of social justice, and she's very much community oriented. And she's a phenomenal mother and an outstanding friend. And I basically, largely attribute my relationship, budding relationship with Able to Vanessa. And I have to tell you, I'm thrilled. We had a presentation where Able presented to Westchester County for the Police Reform Task Force. And in the meantime, I was able to get to meet Jonathan Aroney, and we are quickly becoming very good friends, and it's been a pleasure. So I hope that everyone's going to find this to be enlightening. It really encompasses a huge portion of what we're tasked to do, which is to make sure that we reimagine what law enforcement can be. And there's a tremendous focus on wellness in terms of the community, as well as officer wellness. And I think that when we start to look at each other as a whole, then it paves the road for us to really be successful in the work that we're doing. And I have to tell you that our group, this Irvington Police Reform Task Force, has had some outstanding open conversations. But I believe that everybody is definitely interested in making Irvington the very best police department, as well as the best community that it can possibly be. So as the chief said, it's a bit of a smaller department. So in some respects, it presents challenges, and in other respects, it presents great opportunities. And so we're very much interested in hearing your presentation. And again, we thank you for taking this Friday to do so. So with that, I would introduce you all to Vanessa Watson.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Mayo, for that very kind and warm introduction. I am like the starter before the main event, but I think I would like to, let everyone know why I'm involved and why MasterCard is involved before turning this over to Lisa and Brett to present the main topic. So, as with everyone else, witnessing the brutal killing of George Floyd was a heart-wrenching experience for me. And I was very despondent and in despair. For 2 straight weeks, I was crying nonstop as the mother of a Black son and daughter. And so I recognized that out of pain lies promise. And so what rose up in me, as well as many of us, was a rallying cry for more, for better, and for change. And I knew I wanted to be a part of that change and the movement, starting right here in Westchester County, where I have lived for 25 years, and I've known Mayo for probably all of those 25 years. But at MasterCard, we have a deep involvement in community service and a belief and recognition that our employees exist in the communities we serve. And so the pain that was being experienced by Black people across the nation included those that were within the corporate walls. So any positive changes for the community would not just benefit MasterCard as a company, but employees within the community. It was from this pain and recognition of the pain that MasterCard's In Solidarity commitments were birthed. We committed to creating the opportunities and the connections and the resources to drive equity and justice focused on Black communities. And as we looked for opportunities to make meaningful and systemic changes to police reform and our communities at large, we came across the ABLE project. And after doing our diligence, we knew that this was the project that we would be proud to stand behind and support, where our employees could help to make meaningful change with lasting impact on our communities. So if you're still unsure about why MasterCard and other corporations that have signed on to ABLE like Pepsi and Verizon would lend support to a topic like police reform that seems unrelated to our respective businesses, it is because when we address some of society's most difficult issues, when we improve police and community relationships, and when we achieve a more just and equitable system, we all benefit. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Lisa Kurtz and Brett Parsons, who are ABLE ambassadors. They're part of ABLE, and they actually do this much more than I do and much more eloquently than I ever will. And so Lisa and Brett, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Vanessa. So I'll kick things off. I'm Lisa Kurtz. I am the ABLE project director. I come to this work after 4 years of doing reform work in New Orleans. And for the New Orleans Police Department originated EPIC, which is Ethical Policing is Courageous, back in 2015. And so I worked on that there, and that's really the precursor to ABLE. It was the first law enforcement agency to adopt an active bystandership program. And last summer, after the tragic events that Vanessa spoke about, NOPD was really inundated with calls for people who are interested in bringing EPIC to their departments and bringing an active bystandership program that would really help them to make a meaningful cultural change and to rebuild those relationships with communities, to have something in place that is there to protect both officers and community members, as well as the profession of policing and the community as a whole. And so that's what ABLE was really born out of, this great need from police departments that were clamoring for something. We're looking for something that was going to really help them create that genuine change. So I've been working with ABLE for about the past 6 months, and starting on Monday, I will be the full-time ABLE project director. So I am very excited to be here with all of you, and I will also introduce my colleague, Brett Parson, who is our training coordinator.
Well, thanks, Lisa, and it's great to be here. And Vanessa, listening, it's the first time I've actually got to hear the MasterCard introduction, and it gave me goosebumps to hear that, because it means so much to know that major companies and organizations are behind this and the reason behind it. I actually have a very similar story to you guys at MasterCard. I'm a 27, just under 27-year veteran with the Metropolitan Police Department here in Washington, D.C. Perhaps you've heard of us down here, the small hamlet of D.C. I retired in February of 2020, and for much of my career, I have been working in underserved and marginalized communities. I was in command of a command called Special Liaison Branch, which worked in the Asian, Latino, deaf and hard of hearing, LGBTQ plus, African and faith-based communities, doing training and education and outreach, and also law enforcement. And so I've been part of the reform movement and progressive policing for quite some time, teaching all over the world in law enforcement. But when I retired, I wanted to work for specific organizations and on specific missions that I felt passionate about, and that my full-time job in the past didn't allow me to do that. And then George Floyd happened. And although, Vanessa, I don't have a 15-year-old black son, I grew up in Washington, D.C. as a minority in my school. And most of my friends and family members are part of the African-American community. And as a gay Jewish American, as family members who survived the Holocaust, I had an immediate need to do something. Mike, perhaps you know, I don't know, do we have any other law enforcement on the call? Mike, are you the only one for the police department on the call?
No, we have Lieutenant Pignatelli, Officer Dave Walsh, and Officer John Nairati, from what I see on the screen.
Okay, well, great. It's good to have fellow men and women in blue on the call, but I think you'll probably relate to this as good cops. You know, we have a saying, and all of you who are not in law enforcement have heard it over and over again every time there's a tragedy or a crime that occurs at the hands of someone wearing a badge, and that is that there's nothing a good cop hates more than a bad cop. And it's sort of this rhetorical thing that comes out from police unions and police executives and rank and file cops, and we say it all the time. And it just rings hollow if we don't do anything. And I felt very strongly when I heard about ABLE that this was it. with a capital I exclamation mark, that this was finally something that we could do within law enforcement that could make an impact on that trust, that transparency, and reducing and stopping harm that could occur in our communities, the citizens we serve, and our fellow officers. And the more I got to know about it, the more passionate I became. And I'm lucky enough that they've brought me on as the training coordinator. And so that's what I bring here today. And Lisa and I hope to share with you more about ABLE today, and then more importantly, answer any of your questions. So I'll turn it back over to Lisa at this point.
Thanks. So I am going to share my screen with y'all so you can see a presentation. So Brett and I are going to take you through a little overview of ABLE and a little section of the class. So you'll get a little preview of our training. It will be interactive, so I'll give you plenty of warning, but we'll ask you to use the chat to engage with us a little bit. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll dive in, and then we will, like Brett said, leave plenty of time for your questions. Okay, so I'm hoping that this, that y'all can see this PowerPoint up now. All right, great. So Brett and I talked about who we are. I mentioned that I came here from the New Orleans Police Department, but I am a civilian, so I come from a slightly different angle than Brett. I didn't think I would ever end up working in policing. It was something that just sort of happened because there was an opportunity in New Orleans to make real change and to improve things both for the community as well as for officers. And so ABLE is really allowing us to do that same kind of thing on a national scale. We're able to do that because we have this home at Georgetown Law and because we have seed funding from Shepard Mullen. So we want to say a huge thank you to both of them, and also to, of course, MasterCard and our other corporate partners who make it possible for us to bring this training to now more than 70 agencies across the country and counting. The ABLE Project mission is to make sure that every police officer in the United States has meaningful and effective active bystandership training. We know that there's a lot of training out there that is not very good, that is not very effective, and that officers just don't engage with. And so our training is very much the opposite of that. It's something that, I mean, I think Brett will back me up that one of the most common comments that we get after training is, wow, this was the best training that I've ever gone through. So we have seen a lot of police officers who come in a little bit hesitant because those of us who have worked in law enforcement know that police training isn't always of the highest caliber. And so we really wanted to bring folks the level of professional continuing education that we think police officers deserve. In addition to that, we're going to serve as a clearinghouse for research, for training material, for model policies. We're working with a coalition of folks who have research backgrounds from Georgetown, from Howard University, from Yale University, as well as other academic research partners, to make sure that we're really capitalizing on this opportunity to see how we are able to change the culture of policing across the United States, and also to provide our agencies with the best policies, with the best training, with the best resources that are available. And of course, we're also going to be guiding these agencies. We always like to say this is not just a training program. It's not just a one and done thing where you sit in a classroom for 8 hours and go, okay, I'm trained and now I'm done. We really want this to be, like I said, a part of effective culture change. And so that's why we have 10 ABLE standards that all agencies are required to commit to. And we'll drop a link to our website in the chat so that you can read more about those. But they are designed to make sure that this program is really sustainable and that it's something that is going to be infused throughout the entire department. So we've established some standards and some benchmarks for active bystandership programs. We're going to be working with our partners to continue doing those and to continue building on the successes that we've seen so far in connecting our ABLE partners, agencies, and community groups across the US. Of course, this meeting is just one part of that. And so this work is going to continue, but the base of it, as we said, is this training piece. So I am going to turn it over to Brett to talk you through the first part of our training, which are 2 case studies.
Thank you, Lisa. So the way our curriculum is set up for our Train the Trainer program is we build a foundation to start with on having everyone talking about 3 case studies. For the purposes of time restrictions today, I'm only going to talk about 2 of them, but I will tell you that the first case that we talk about is a case that I'm not going to discuss because, quite honestly, you all know similar cases. It is a police misconduct case that involves excessive force where an intervention didn't occur. And so we do one of those case studies where we talk about that. and we eventually talk about why intervention didn't occur. When we present these, we ask our potential trainers, our students, not to comment about them. We're just laying the groundwork here. So I'm going to share with you two of these stories. The first story I'd like to share with you is the story about Detective Jensen. Detective Jensen was a police officer for about 10 years. He had been a detective for about 3 years. He was a really good detective. He was a go-to type of detective. He would constantly get thrown tough assignments. And he was also a really dependable detective, such that when people were not available, he would take extra shifts, and he would work double shifts sometimes to cover for people. Now, at first, this was really great for him because in the police world, double shifts mean extra money, overtime, and he was really enjoying that. But then, as happens in police work, that lack of sleep and downtime started to get to him. So he started to overcome that, and the fact that he wasn't being able to hang out with his family, his significant other, his children, go to those events that he wanted to. And he cut back more on sleeping time, and he started to pound caffeine and try and get through it that way. That was working well for him up until his last day before he was going to go on days off, where he had worked 2 consecutive shifts, no sleep, was trying to get through it, pounding those monster drinks and that caffeine. And he was the primary detective called to a homicide scene. For those of you that haven't been to a homicide scene, it was pretty typical. It was an outdoor scene. The decedent's remains were still on the scene. Media had gathered, a rather sizable group of media with their cameras, both video and still photography. Detective Jensen got a briefing from the officers who were there, and one of the officers actually commented to him, "Hey, you're looking kind of rough." It was noticeable that he was tired. It was noticeable that he was looking haggard. But they laughed it off. He went underneath the crime scene tape and he walked towards the decedent's body. This decedent was a rather large male. He was probably pushing 300 pounds. And Detective Jensen made a comment and said something to the effect of, "Wow, I didn't know it was whale hunting season." And that got a laugh from the officers who were gathered nearby, and that fed Detective Jensen. And Detective Jensen then started to make some other jokes and actually made a harpooning motion as if he were harpooning a whale. And then out of the corner of his eye, he saw that he was the focus of the media, that those cameras were all fixed on him, the shutters were clicking, and the videos were running. And it was at that moment he realized that he was going to be the focus of a story. And in fact, he was. He was on the 5 o'clock news. The department was embarrassed, and his career stalled. He had no upward mobility at that point in his career. Those who spoke to him afterwards, he had great remorse. He couldn't believe he did what he did. He would never disrespect any human being, dead or alive, that way. He realized he was exhausted, but what he realized most was there were all these people that were there and nobody said anything to him. And he questioned that. Why they allowed him to continue in that way? So the Detective Jensen story is one of the stories that we tell, in addition to the misconduct and excessive force story that we tell. And then the second story, unfortunately, is even a little bit more tragic. It involves a death as well, and I'll share it with you now. We call this our FTO Mcdonald story. FTO Mcdonald, for those of you that don't know, an FTO is a field training officer. Sometimes they also have supervisory responsibilities. FTO Mcdonald was working a shift with several other officers. He was training an officer, and they received a call for a domestic violence call for intimate partner violence. And this was a priority call because there had been shots fired. In fact, the 911 call from the female that called said that the father of her baby had in fact shot at her, but those shots did not take effect. So as you might imagine, there was a sizable police response that was a rapid response, and FTO Mcdonald and about 5 or 6 other officers arrived on the scene, and those other officers were all junior to MPO Mcdonald or FTO Mcdonald. They some of them only had a short period of time on, were still on probation. They met with the 911 caller out front. She was upset, but she was less scared and more angry about what happened. She said that the person that had shot at her baby's father, was in back, and they immediately moved towards the back to locate that individual and to take him into custody. While they were moving towards the back of this very skinny kind of row house, they encountered a firearm laying on a table. And I know that my cops on this call know what that means. If you encounter one firearm, most cops know that there are probably other firearms around at that point. But they kept on moving. They secured that firearm. And when they arrived to that back bedroom, FTO Mcdonald was in fact the lead officer. They encountered the suspect, Smith was his last name. And he was sort of wrapped up in ratty sheets and kind of balled up and moaning a little bit as if he were in some sort of pain. FTO Mcdonald immediately got him out of bed and he threw the handcuffs on him. For those who've never been through police training, I will show my police friends, he handcuffed him palm to palm as opposed to palms out. It's not something that police officers are trained to do. In fact, that's an improper handcuffing technique. And those officers who were with him, none of them said a word about that handcuffing technique. He then proceeded to immediately frisk him. And anybody that's been in policing for any period of time would know that a frisk at that point is inappropriate because you have firearms involved and he's now in custody. And so a full search would have been necessary at that point. But none of the officers said anything about this insufficient search that FTO Mcdonald conducted. So now we have the improper handcuffing and the inadequate search. And then, was there a question?
I'm sorry, sir. Was he cuffed in the front or the back?
He was cuffed in the back, but unfortunately it was palms forward, not palms out, Howie. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying that, because I put mine in front because you wouldn't have seen them behind me on the call.
Yeah.
So now they walk Smith out to a transport that's awaiting, and Officer Clarence Green is the transport officer. The suspect is then placed in the back of Officer Green's transport car, and there's no transfer search. I will tell you that almost every police department in this nation has a policy that when you transfer a suspect from one person to another, there's a subsequent search that's done for safety purposes and just verify that there's no contraband or weapons on them. But that wasn't done. And again, multiple officers on the scene watched as he was placed in this cruiser. Well, you probably can see what's happening and coming down the pike, and I'm sorry if it's shocking, but Officer Clarence Green proceeded to transport him to the lockup, and Smith was able to get his hands from his back towards his front because he was improperly handcuffed. He was then able to reach into his waistband, retrieve a 9mm handgun, and then reach through the partition, and he shot Clarence Green above the vest, and he was killed instantly. His car crashed into a telephone pole, and Smith crawled through the partition and escaped. This is obviously shocking. Jonathan Aroney was the monitor at that time and was able to view the video from this. And he said it's absolutely the worst thing he's ever heard and seen in his entire life. For police officers, I know I get choked up thinking about this happening to Officer Clarence Green. But the question we ask is, how did police officers who would have run into gunfire to save Clarence Green, who would have sacrificed their own lives to protect him, how did they on 3 occasions not step forward? And if just one of them had done something, how could that have changed? And so these are 2 of the case studies that we use throughout our training. And you'll see as we proceed here, we use those to reach back because we'll be teaching skills and talking about theory as we go on. And that's why we don't discuss it now. We don't work through what could have changed now. We're just planting that seed to give you and our students the basis to talk from the same stories, the same case studies. So I'll turn it back over to Lisa now.
Thanks, Brett. So we're going to have folks thinking about these stories, ruminating on them as we move forward to talk about what ABLE is. So you'll start to see why it's so important and how it ties back to those case studies. So ABLE is based on the principles of active bystandership that have been studied in social science for more than 5 decades now. And our ABLE curriculum was put together with the help of one of the foremost researchers in active bystandership, Dr. Irvin Staub. And the foundation of ABLE is authorizing and empowering police officers to intervene in each other's actions regardless of their rank. We'll talk more about that in a little while, but we know that rank is a huge barrier for people. And so we want to give them tools specifically to deal with that, as well as the other barriers that face them. We don't just tell them, hey, you have a duty to intervene. Hey, it's really important to intervene, go intervene. We actually teach them how to intervene successfully. A lot of times when we talk about this, people think, well, of course I would have done something. Oh my gosh, yes. It's so obvious that someone should have done something. But the thing is that all the people who are on that scene who didn't act most likely also thought, oh yes, if I were ever in that situation, I would absolutely do something. We know that there's a really big step that we have to take from recognizing a problem to actually having the skills to act on that problem. And so that's what the ABLE training teaches. And then lastly, and very importantly, ABLE provides protections for those who do intervene. So I mentioned that we have these 10 standards, and one of them is that we have a very strong anti-retaliation policy in place for people who do intervene. We know that there's a lot of fear out there, a lot of talk about the thin blue line, the blue wall of silence. And so we make sure that the culture of the agency is such that officers who do intervene will be protected, both by their leadership as well as by their fellow officers. Just as importantly, we want to talk about what ABLE is not. So ABLE is not an internal affairs program. ABLE is something that every department across an agency has to commit to and has to be on board with. So internal affairs is on board with this. And in fact, internal affairs and coming onto ABLE agrees that a successful intervention will be a formal mitigating factor, even when a disciplinary action has occurred. So when there is misconduct, if there's a successful intervention to prevent that misconduct from escalating, then that will be considered a formal mitigating factor in any discipline. But ABLE in itself is not an internal affairs program. It is not a discipline program, and it's not a mediation program. It's not a reporting program. ABLE is actually in place to prevent us from getting to any of these places. So ABLE doesn't change reporting requirements. If something was reportable before ABLE, it's reportable with ABLE. If something was not reportable before ABLE, it does not become reportable with ABLE. The idea of ABLE is that before we get to a place where anything that happens that we might need to report, that might lead to discipline, that might lead us to internal affairs, that might lead the department to embarrassment, that a fellow officer is going to step in and stop that behavior to prevent that harm, to prevent harm to our police officers, to prevent harm to our community members, and of course also to prevent harm to this profession of policing, to the image of policing, and to our community as a whole, to the relationship between our agencies and our communities. ABLE is based upon 3 pillars: preventing misconduct, reducing mistakes, and promoting health and wellness. And I think maybe you can start to see how these tie back to the case studies that Brett went over. So we know in the story of FTO Mcdonald, where Clarence Green tragically lost his life, that there's a series of mistakes that happened there. And if anyone had stepped forward and intervened there, Clarence Green might still be alive today. The Detective Jensen case study, I think, is really interesting because, yeah, Detective Jensen made mistakes. Yes, Detective Jensen absolutely committed misconduct, but at the heart of these problems were health and wellness issues. And this is what we see in a lot of cases, is that when you look at underlying factors, there are usually health and wellness issues. We know that police officers have higher instances of stress, certainly on the job, of anxiety, of depression. And so these are all things that we think about. All of these pillars, as you can see, are co-equal. One is not higher than the other. These are all things that are equally important for us to emphasize as we go through ABLE. They're all things that are equally important for the leadership and the personnel of any department to be behind, to support, and to know that their job there is to look out for one another, to do all 3 of these things. Even if these are conversations that we're not typically used to having, these are all things that are going to be considered a part of how we show our loyalty to one another. So Brett, you want to talk about why it is that we see these cases where people think, yes, of course I would have intervened. Yes, of course, anyone in that position would have done something. Why do people actually not do that in practice?
Absolutely, Lisa. And this is where actually we're going to get a little taste of how the class works as far as participation, because I'm going to ask you to just help me a little bit and give me some responses. You can just throw it right into the chat if you could. I'm just going to ask you a couple questions about this. So you yourselves, even if you're not police officers, looking, for instance, at the Jensen story, at the FTO Mcdonald story, or in instances where you may or may not have intervened yourself in a situation, what do you think was a contributing factor into why people do not intervene? What reasons do you think that is? Feel free to just type those in and we'll talk about some of them, I'm sure. Fear. So Vanessa says fear right away. Okay. Others? Retaliation. Okay, great. Fear of repercussions, so also similar to retaliation. The culture, a culture of that thin blue line perhaps, or a culture within a company or a work group, absolutely. Other reasons why people may not have intervened, or what it would have been an inhibitor at all. Thinking someone else would do it, absolutely. A dispersion of responsibility, not thinking someone else. Uncertainty. Kay, I assume you're probably talking about uncertainty. Am I seeing what I'm seeing, or is it actually wrong or not wrong? Excellent, really good. You're nailing all of the things that we normally talk about. Any others before I move on here?
Yes, I'm trying to type it up. I'm just going to say lack of training would be a main cause.
Okay, lack of training. Yeah. I see rank difference, huge one there, right? FTO Mcdonald is a senior officer. He's their training officer. He has power and control over some of them. The young probationary officer that's with him, literally his job probably depends upon him giving him proper marks. Seniority, absolutely. Rank, absolutely. So you begin to see that we now are teaching our students that it's natural that there are going to be barriers, there are going to be obstacles to actual intervening. All right. There are going to be reasons why, and cops are no different than anyone else. And we're going to talk about how that's true. Go ahead, Lisa. So here is actually what the experts say, the folks who've done the research. And I forget if Lisa mentioned it or not, but Dr. Irvin Staub and some of these other researchers, this goes back to like the Holocaust. Okay. Looking at how men and women during the Holocaust who saw these atrocities going on and could have intervened to stop them, chose not to. And there's been research going on, and it's been replicated over and over again. But look at that. I mean, you basically named all of those things. The not my job was that, will somebody else do it? The culture, fear of crossing boundaries, diffusion of responsibility. And there are more. Go ahead, Lisa. So let me ask you a question. Do any of you know what was one of the United States' first successful peer intervention programs? And I will give you a hint. It's not necessarily specific to law enforcement. Anyone just come off mute and feel free to yell it out if you think you know what one of the country's first peer intervention programs was. Well, that gave us a hint. Thanks a lot, Lisa.
Sorry, Brett. I tried to click away the chat and instead I clicked on the answer.
Well, maybe nobody saw it. Go ahead and populate it. So I know all of you, because all of you look old enough to remember when this campaign came out. Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk is in fact a peer intervention program. If you think about, before this program came out of Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk, what was the campaign? The campaign was towards you, the driver, you, the potential drunk driver. You shouldn't drink and drive. Don't drink and drive. Think about the damage you could cause. Think about the lives that will be caused, that are going to be taken. Well, that wasn't very successful. I mean, it seems obvious looking back. You're trying to tell someone to remember what you've taught them when they're drunk, and the retention rate's probably not very good. But what this did was this focused on the passenger. This focused on the other friends at the party. These focused on the people around that potential driver to say, no, hang on. I'm not going to let you cause harm to yourself or to others. And they saw amazing results as a result of this program going nationwide. And in fact, it's one of the most successful programs that there's ever been with regard to peer intervention programs. Go ahead. So there have been other programs. One of the questions we get, and we anticipate this every time we teach the Train the Trainer, is cops are a little salty about why us. Why are you picking on us? Why are we the ones that always have to have training? Why is it always us that you focus on screwing up? Well, what we do is we talk to them about the fact that it's not just you. In fact, we failed you. As I think it was Mike that said, we haven't given you the training. We haven't given you the tools. So we teach them about 3 different areas where bystandership has actually served them to prevent harm. Now, let me just ask, come off mute if you want to. Can anyone tell me what they see in the far left-hand photograph there? What is that?
Cockpit.
Yeah, it's an airline cockpit. It's an airline cockpit. And let me just ask you, what problem, what harm could they have potentially been looking at in an airline cockpit that they needed to take action on?
Hijacking.
Hijackings, okay. Anyone else?
Flight of birds.
Bird strikes, okay.
Plane malfunction.
Plane malfunction, okay.
Alcohol abuse or sleepiness.
Alcohol abuse and sleepiness. You know, these are all in the areas that we're talking, but there's actually a much broader and obvious one that you're not even thinking about.
Spotting something dangerous on the ground.
I'm sorry, John, say that again.
Spotting something dangerous on the ground.
And if you don't, what could happen, John?
It could affect the plane, or it also just could continue to happen and nobody's going to get the protection they need.
And you would eventually do what? Crash. The problem they were trying to address was pilot error. And literally the case that motivated this was where a plane flew into the side of a mountain and the black box revealed that the co-pilot actually was concerned but never said anything. And so we use this as an example. First of all, what similarities do you see in an airline cockpit that you also see in law enforcement? My cops on the call, what are the similarities in an airline cockpit to being on a police department?
A lot of equipment that needs to be utilized.
Yep, an awful lot of training and equipment that needs to be utilized. Your attention is diverted and all over the place. Absolutely. What else?
The safety of other people.
Yep. If you make a mistake, harm could come to others. You're protecting others. Absolutely. What else?
You're working with a partner?
You're working with a partner. In some cases, multiple partners. In large airplanes, you could have a co-pilot, you could have a relief crew, you could have a navigator. You might or may not have somebody riding in the jump seat who's riding or deadheading to another destination. So you could have several people in that cockpit. Anything else that's similar?
You're listening to people who are not in the cockpit giving you information.
You're being dispatched. You're seeing a lot of similarities. How about the difference between the guy on the left and the guy on the right?
Oh, it was definitely one's above the other in rank.
Yeah. How about rank? There's rank and seniority in that cockpit. A lot of similarities, right? So they needed to address that. And the airline industry started in the Air Force, actually. They implemented a bystandership program where top to bottom, pilots were trained what inhibited them from intervening, how to intervene, to accept intervention, and they saw these types of tragic crashes decrease precipitously. So let's go to the far right for a second. The photo on the far right, can anyone recognize what that is?
An emergency room.
It in fact could be an emergency room. It's actually a little different place in the hospital.
Operating room.
There you go. Yeah, you had a 50-50 shot, Kay. You got it the second time. I'll give you half credit. But absolutely, it's an operating room. So what problem could there possibly be in operating rooms that they need to address that was causing harm?
Misidentification.
Misidentification in what way, Kay?
That you have the wrong patient or
that would
you
be a
have the
big
wrong
problem.
body.
Yes.
Huh?
That would be a big problem, wouldn't it be? The Kay comes in for an appendectomy and actually we thought it was a maternity case. Yeah, that would be a
Or
big
a
problem.
wrong body part.
Yep.
Or
Amputation of the wrong
allergies to
limb.
medications.
Kay, you and I could just talk for hours about this, couldn't we? Other people, what other mistakes or harm could potentially be in an operating room?
Keeping track of everything that's used.
Yeah, like a sponge, a syringe, anything like that. Absolutely. All harmful things that could happen. So you can see where now an operating room has some tragic, and what are the consequences?
Death.
Yeah. Lo and behold, here we go again. We have people's lives on the line. Real substantive harm can come. Life or death harm can come from these mistakes. Now, here's the question. How is this similar to policing? How is the environment of an operating room like that cockpit and like police work?
You need to follow procedures, best practices.
Yeah, absolutely. There are rules, there are regulations, there are lots and lots of science things, which is why I became a cop and not a doctor or a nurse. Absolutely. What else?
You have to be able to act quickly and correctly.
Under pressure, right?
Yes.
Split-second decisions. Absolutely. What about the similarities as far as some of the dynamics in the operating room themselves between the individuals?
Chain of command, rank.
How about that? No, that we don't have a captain or a lieutenant or a captain and a co-pilot, but do we have rank in an
Cooperation.
operating room? Do we have rank in an operating room?
No.
Yeah, lead surgeon.
Well, yes, but it's more of a team effort. It's more cooperative.
Oh,
Kay, it is definitely a team effort, but I would say to you that in most operating rooms that surgeon is running the show. In
All right.
most instances, that surgeon.
It's the nurses that are taking care of everything.
Are you a nurse, Kay? You're a nurse, aren't you?
Yes.
I knew it. I knew it. There's
We
always
know
a plan.
better.
I know better also. But you have to agree that especially some doctors, especially when you get into some of the dynamics of gender, most of the time, who's that surgeon going to be, male or female? Most of the time, who are those nurses going to be, male or female?
Well, female, but now we have an ever increasing number of males.
Absolutely. But you have this dynamic of power, of seniority, of who's in charge that create inhibitors, those same type of inhibitors that we see in airline cockpits and that we see on the scenes of where police are interacting with citizens. And so, yes, in medical schools, in nursing schools, in medical assistant schools all over the country, now active bystandership is taught, so that when that doctor goes to the wrong leg or arm or digit and starts to say, okay, we're going to amputate, someone speaks up. When they start to make a fatal error on the amount of a drug or a decision, someone speaks up to save them from harm, from their career, but also to save that patient from harm. And then finally, the one in the middle, not as obvious to most people. Does anyone recognize what that's a photograph of? Not a specific place, but generally what we're trying to depict here?
School.
It is, in fact, it is a school of higher learning. It is a college campus.
Yeah.
It is a college campus, yeah. Now, here's the big question.
Which one?
No, not which one.
I'm intimidated by that school.
As somebody said Mount Holyoke in the chat, I see. They might want to retract that comment in just a second. What harm could there possibly be on a college campus that needed to be addressed using active bystandership? What problem do you think they were seeking to mitigate or stop?
Date rape.
Hazing.
I heard date rape. Was that you, Howie?
Yeah.
Nailed it. Right out of the box. You watched this presentation before?
No,
You
when I went to school in the 80s, I remember how big it was at Florida State.
Yeah. So sexual assault is a massive problem on college campuses. It's a massive problem in our society generally, but college campuses are a particularly difficult place to combat sexual abuse. And much like drunk driving, our efforts to stop it, to mitigate it initially were focused on the attacker, the abuser, the rapist. Hey, you shouldn't do that. That's illegal. It's not right to do that. You need to have self-control. Well, that wasn't working. And so what they started was a green dot program at some college campuses, which then taught other students to intervene. You have to be your brother or your sister's keeper. And by doing that, by teaching them how to intervene, when to intervene, how to do it effectively, we've seen the upwards of 33% decrease on some college campuses of sexual abuse cases. Now, here's the most difficult question is, how is this similar to policing? It's not really like an airline cockpit or an operating room, but does anyone see any similarities to how this could apply, how there are similarities to policing? I have any fraternity members or sorority members on the call? None? pledges as opposed to brothers and sisters, senior classmen as far as, or lower classmen?
Well, basically, you don't want to snitch on people. And
Yeah.
it's intimidation. I was in a fraternity, and even putting fraternity aside, you got to draw the line where you're going to say something or keep your mouth shut.
Yeah, and there are natural inhibitors to that. Peer pressure, not wanting to be considered the person at the party that killed the party, right? Getting a reputation of being the one that wags their finger at people. Yeah, so these are all inhibitors that on a college campus could prohibit or inhibit someone from intervening and saving him or her from a sexual abuse.
It's also the change in attitude on how it was approached. Administrations in colleges used to blame the victim instead of going after the perpetrator. It's the same thing that we're looking at right now because of George Floyd. Okay, I mean, unless you're getting a change in attitude towards what's going on, you're not going to see change.
John, that's a great observation. You know, there are some people that look at, let's look at the George Floyd situation and they say, well, if he hadn't been on drugs, if he hadn't resisted initially, if he had just done what he was told, then the officer wouldn't have had to use any type of force at all. It's that same type of victim blaming when you're talking about sexual abuse. Well, what was she wearing? Why was she there? Did she have too much to drink? Yeah, those attitudes were prevalent back then. Unfortunately, they still do exist. And active bystandership helps you overcome some of those cultural norms and thoughts to have a successful intervention. So we tell officers about these three other industries and other milieus where active bystandership has been used successfully so that they don't feel like, hey, it's just cops. Now they understand that this is effective, that the research is the same research that goes into those three areas as what we use in the ABLE program. So I'll turn it back over to Lisa at this point.
And it's not just that we see this working in other professions. It's actually that there is, like I said, more than 50 decades.
50 decades.
More than 50 years of research now that shows how the bystandership effect comes into play. So we're going to look now at some of the social science underlying the principles of active bystandership. In our full class, we go over 4 of these and we have a lot of discussion. In the interest of time, so that we do leave y'all with some time for questions, we're going to just go through 2 of them. I'm going to go through them a little bit more quickly, but I still do want to have that interactive element. So there will be time in just a minute when I'm going to ask you to participate in the chat. But first, I'm going to introduce Stanley Milgram's experiment on obedience to authority. So some of y'all, especially if you studied any sort of sociology classes in school, you may be familiar with the Milgram experiment. Very quick overview is that Stanley Milgram, like Brett and I, was a young Jewish American, but he was living during the time right after the Holocaust, right after World War II. And so in 1961, against the backdrop of the Adolf Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, Eichmann was invoking the Nuremberg defense, which I'm sure any of y'all history buffs on here know was, I was just following orders. And Milgram was looking at this and saying, wow, all of these people, including this high-ranking Nazi official, was saying, no, I'm not responsible. I was told to do this by an authority figure, and so I feel like what I was doing was justified. So Milgram was really looking at, could something like the atrocities of World War II happen here? Could regular Americans be persuaded to carry out horrific acts against their fellow humans? So he set up this experiment. It was done at Yale University, where he was a professor. So the way that this works is that we have 2 people who show up. There's an experimenter in a lab coat, and the experimenter says, hey, we're doing this test. We're studying the effects of pain and punishment on learning. I'm going to assign one of you the role of teacher and one of you the role of learner. These roles are randomly assigned. So we pick learner and we pick teacher. The researcher takes the learner into a room. This is what you're seeing here. And we're strapping him to the chair. And they say, yeah, this is just to prevent excessive movements. And then they put electrodes on the arm of the learner. And then the researcher takes the teacher into an adjoining room where they can hear the learner, but they can no longer see the learner. And the teacher sits down in front of a switch box. The switches go from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts. And so the researcher says, here's what we're going to be doing. we're going to be administering a series of shocks to the learner whenever they get an answer to our questions wrong. So we're going to ask them this series of questions. First one wrong, he gets a 15-volt shock. Second one wrong, he gets a 30-volt shock. Third one, a 45-volt shock, and on and on and on. There are 30 increments of this, all the way up to 450 volts. So here's a little peek behind the curtain. This learner is actually a plant. He's part of the study. These shocks are not real. No one is actually being harmed here. Don't want anyone to worry about this person's safety. But as far as the teacher knows, these are very real shocks. It's set up so a little buzzing sound is made when he presses the switch. A light goes on. There's a little voltage meter that goes. So as far as the teacher knows, he is shocking a fellow human. Every time he gets an answer wrong, he's increasing the voltage. So what I want to ask you is here in the chat, I want y'all to tell me, what percentage of our teachers do you think shocked a person up to 300 volts? And before you answer, let me tell you that when this first starts out, our learner is just like, okay, this is fine. As we go on though, around 75 volts, he starts grunting. 120 volts, he's saying, wow, this really hurts. At 150 volts, he says, I will not go on. I don't want to do this experiment anymore. Let me out. Around 285 volts, the learner says, I have a heart problem. I'm in so much pain right now. I don't want to do this anymore. Please, you have to let me out of here. What percentage of people then go up to 300 volts? So let's just put those percentages in the chat if you would. Harvey says 75%. Harvey does not think very well of people. 85, wow, K's not have a great outlook on humanity. Dave says 40%, 25% I'm seeing, 80%, 75. So y'all are pretty high. You're thinking that a lot of people are just gonna go along with this. 89%, okay. 30% Howie. Howie has a much better view of humanity. He thinks people are going to stop once they realize they're causing someone pain. I'm seeing 50%. So y'all have quite the range here, but a lot of you seem to think that, you know, a fair number of people are going to continue on with this. So here's what happens next. After we do, if the person goes up to 300 volts, afterwards at 330, the learner who's in the other room, who the teacher thinks that they're giving these shocks to, the learner is crying out, this is excruciating, I cannot go on, I'm in so much pain right now, I refuse to answer any more questions. And so if the teacher keeps going, then we hear an agonized scream from the learner, and then the learner falls completely silent, as though maybe he has fallen unconscious or even died. So my question to you then is, after this happens, how many people, what percentage of people do you think go all the way up to the end of that switch box to 450 volts? And if you would please put those in the chat now, and we can see how those answers have changed. So Christopher still thinks 70% of people, but Dave thinks only 5. He thinks that, you know, thinking maybe you might have just killed a guy is actually going to have a pretty big effect on you. Kay still thinks 70% of people are going to go all the way up there. Jorge thinks only 5%. Kay, do you want to tell me, why do you think that it's so high?
I think because they've already, first of all, the thing that I would question is whether or not the person was dead. Did they check that? But they've already gone that far, and they're already into this routine of following directions. And I think then it's almost inevitable that they continue going on.
Okay, that's really interesting. And then I would love to hear from someone with a lower guess, maybe Harvey or John, if one of y'all is able to just go off mute and tell me, why do you think it's going to be a little bit lower?
I'm just looking for people to have a little bit of humanity in them, to hear the screams and say, okay, that's enough. But still some would continue.
Yeah, so you're thinking, all right, hopefully enough people are going to just say, wow, I'm a decent person, I don't want to hurt someone else. But you think there's still going to be some people out there who just are going to keep going because they're told to. So let's see what actually happened in the experiment. What did we see happen? Every single person went up to 300 volts after the learner was talking about having a heart condition, after the learner said, I don't want to do this anymore. Every one of those teachers gave what they thought were shocks up to a level of 300 volts. 65% of them went all the way up to 450 volts, even knowing that that man might be dead in the next room. So For the sake of time, we're not going to have a lot of talk about this. Like we said, we definitely want to leave time for y'all to ask questions. But I want to tell you, we have a lot of discussion about this. So this doesn't initially seem very obvious. Why are we telling you this? How does this relate to policing? How does this relate to active bystandership? If we think back to that story about FTO Mcdonald and Clarence Green, and we know that a lot of people just didn't step up and say something, there was no malevolent authority there. There was no one ordering the younger folks not to step in. But that authority still had weight. People were still looking to that authority to see what they should do when they were deciding, okay, should I do anything? Well, this person of a higher rank thinks everything's okay, and they must know better than me. So we see a lot of those effects of authority in different ways. And then the other thing that I like to talk about here is the way that people justified what they were doing. Brett talked a little bit about victim blaming. So we saw this. There are actually videos that you can watch online, which are pretty disturbing, of people going through this process. And the teachers start to sort of say, okay, a lot of them, every single one of them says, I don't want to do this. And then the researcher gives them these prods to continue. So some folks just continue on. Some folks say, well, I can't be held responsible for this. When the researcher says, don't worry, you're not responsible, I am. Folks continue on. But the really interesting one for me is that some people start going, wow, I can't believe the learner is this stupid. Why is he doing this? Why is he so dumb? Why is he making me do this to him? And so we use this to talk about dehumanization, about how important it is to remember to have empathy for people, to not start thinking about people as though they deserve what has befallen them, to remember that no matter what is going on, we have to use our moral courage to stand up for what is right. So I'm going to really quickly go through this next experiment because we want to also talk to you about some of the tactics that we use to actually teach folks how to intervene successfully, like we talked about. So this is an experiment done by Urban Staub, who I mentioned is one of the founders of ABLE, and he is on our board of advisors. And he did this experiment where two people go into a room, and a researcher tells them, okay, you're going to be working on this puzzle together. And they think maybe, okay, we're looking at cooperation, at how people work together, people who don't know each other. So sitting in a room, and there's this door at the far end of the room. It's not the door you came in from, it's a different door. And from behind that door, after a few minutes of sitting doing the puzzle, comes a loud crash and a kind of muffled cry. It's very clearly someone who seems like they've been hurt. And so there are three different scenarios. Again, we only have one real subject here. The other person is actually a compatriot of the experiment. And so in the first scenario, that person who's in on it says, hey, that was probably another experiment. It has nothing to do with us. They go back to doing the puzzle. In the second scenario, the person says, wow, that sounded bad. You go into that room. I'm going to go find the person in charge and get help. And then in the third scenario, the person says, wow, that sounded bad. Maybe we should do something. But then they remain seated. So I'm going to ask you to just guess on the first two of these. So on number one, when the person says, probably another experiment, nothing to do with us, put in the chat, what percentage of people do you think still got up and went through that door and checked to see what had happened on the other side? So John thinks only 5% of people went through. Kay is a little higher at 30. Harvey thinks 10, 33%. So y'all are pretty low on this one. You think if someone tells you, hey, there's nothing to worry about, even if that person is a complete stranger, that you're probably going to just take their word for it. Okay, so now let's talk about the second scenario. The person says, that sounded bad. You go in, I'm going to go find the person in charge. In that scenario, in scenario number two, let's put in the chat, what percentage of people do you think then go in to find out what happened behind the door? 25%. Okay, so still a little low there, John. Any other guesses here? 100% from Mayo, 5%, 80%, 30. So y'all are pretty split on this one. You're not really sure. So we are going to look at the effects of this, and we're going to leave the third one for time, but I'll explain to you the effect of it here. So in the first situation where the person says probably another experiment, only 25% of people say, no, actually, I think maybe it was something, and they get up and go check. In the second scenario, when someone says that sounded bad, you go in and I'll find the person in charge, 100% of people. So this really shows us the power of the bystander. If you can engage an ally, if you can be that first person to stand up and say, I think something is wrong and I'm going to do something about it, you are much more likely to have other people then who also step up and follow you. And in the third scenario, what we see is sometimes people think, well, I'll just be neutral. I'll point out that there's a problem, but it's not my place to do anything about it. So I'll let other people just take charge. So what happens there? 66% of people say, well, I'm going to go into the other room. So we see that it's sort of in between. That bystander still has tremendous power. So they've increased the likelihood that the person is going to go in by pointing out a problem. But by them failing to act, they are decreasing the likelihood versus what it would have been if they joined that person as an ally. If they said, I'm going to be courageous, I invite you to join me in this. So again, we talk a lot about this. How could this have changed the outcome for Clarence Green, for Detective Jensen, if just one person had come forward and had said, hey, I think something is wrong here and I'm going to step up and address it. So again, we have so much great discussion on this, but for the interest of time, we want to show you just a small little bit about our tactics that we actually teach people to make sure that these interventions are going to be as successful as possible. So I'll turn it back over to Brett to talk about what makes an intervention work.
So I know you'll find this hard to believe, but we know some things about cops and how they learn. Any cop will tell you that most of them are better learners when they do the task, when they are taught the task and they get a chance to exercise those skills and develop what we refer to in the business as muscle memory. I mean, just think about firearms training. Wouldn't it be ridiculous if we handed out guns to recruit officers, showed them a PowerPoint, and told them what the law was and said, all right, you're good now? No, we would never do that. We take them to a firing range, we teach them tactics of how to fire a weapon, and then we actually have them do it over and over and over again. Did I lose everybody?
No,
My
Oh, are
computer
you still
just,
there, Brett?
Yep, I'm here. Did you lose me?
no, we hear you.
Lisa, are you there?
I'm here. Are you trapped in an alternate dimension?
I'm good. I'm good.
Okay.
My screen went completely blank for a second. So I
Oh,
don't know
no.
what the heck happened.
I can't see
You
you.
have
but I
it
hear
back
you.
now?
I have you back now. If you can hear me, I'm going to continue.
Okay, so Brett, we just have the 3 steps of ABLE, and what we're going to do is just really quickly talk over this model because we do want to leave y'all time for questions. So
Absolutely. So we teach tactics. We teach tactics. We teach a tactic of notice, decide, act. Look around, see, notice what you're doing, notice what other people are doing, decide, actually be decisive. I need to take action. And then finally, we teach actual tactics that you can take for a successful intervention and how to step it up and escalate that intervention if you need to.
And then the last piece that we do there is also to follow up with, okay, well, what are we going to do after an intervention? So this, I think, is really important. Like Brett said, we spend a lot of time on this. We're not going to go through it with y'all because we do want to leave time for questions, but really important for us to really walk people through, okay, what are the things that you notice? How do you make that decision? And then, as Brett said, really importantly, how do you act? And then we also want to say, okay, well, how are we going to have these conversations afterward? If we did intervene and it went well, let's talk about it. Let's make sure that a similar situation doesn't happen again. And if we accepted an intervention, then let's think about what led us to that place. How can we prevent it from happening again? If we intervened and it didn't go so well, let's also talk about that. What can we do so that if there's a similar situation, first of all, we want to prevent it in the first place, but if we can't do that, how can we make our intervention more successful in the future? And then lastly, if we failed to intervene in the moment, why was that? And what can we do now after the fact to mitigate any harm that may have been caused? So that's a super quick overview, and I'm going to stop screen sharing for just a minute because I want to open up the floor for questions for me and or Brett, but we will make sure that all of you have our contact information before we leave you. So I want to open the floor to anyone out here. Do y'all have any questions or initial thoughts or feedback for us?
I have a comment.
Yes, please.
Okay, so when you were talking before about nurses and doctors, I think that teaching the responsibility. So for instance, a doctor writes an order for a drug or an amount that's incorrect. It's the nurse's responsibility who administers the drug. So I think that if officers are trained, it is your responsibility if you see something wrong, not to do it, to do something about it, because you're the one who will be responsible for that act. And I think putting that responsibility there changes the outlook as to rank or anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about empowering people. So I think
Right.
a lot of times, when people come on to any job, when they're very young, when they're inexperienced, they feel like, well, I just have to go along with whatever anyone else thinks. Maybe I'm wrong. I think that this is the wrong dosage, or I think that this is the wrong course of action. But, this person is senior to me, so I'm going to go with what they say. And Kay, what we've seen in nursing is that when we teach nursing students early on in the curriculum, like you just said, this is your responsibility. And actually, like, you have an obligation to bring up these issues to nurses who are senior to you, to doctors who are senior to you. We see a tremendous change in the behavior, and we see that people, once you give them permission, are a lot more likely to do these things.
And in nursing, you have to sign. You're putting your name. You're not putting the doctor's name. You have to put your own name there. So you have to accept that responsibility.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Kay.
I agree with Kay that the word responsibility is a key thing in all of this. When, in the experiment, when it was that person's responsibility, you saw that the people were just raising up the charge without any, without much thought about it. Having responsibility, the co-pilot, sharing responsibility if something bad takes place is a key thing that wasn't always there in the past. So I think that's one avenue we have to look into more.
You know what though, John? I wish that were enough, that moral courage and a feeling of responsibility was enough, but it doesn't happen. All of us would like to believe that we would intervene, but what we know based upon the research that you've just seen is we don't. Even police officers say they intervene all the time, when in fact they're not intervening. And there's a reason for that, by the way. We remember the times that we intervene a lot more than we remember the times we didn't intervene. That's the way our brain works. So really good point, John.
But you were discussing drunk driving before, and you really didn't see a big change in drunk driving until you started seeing bars being hit with major lawsuits if they let somebody go out and drive drunk, or people who were throwing a party getting ramifications if somebody got into an accident who had become drunk at their party.
Yeah, so everyone has to feel responsible to intervene, but it's also very important that there's a culture where people know that their intervention is likely to be accepted. Because if you intervene and shot down time and again, you're going to stop intervening. And so
I think it's more than being accepted. It's expected. So there shouldn't be any choice in it. It's what you must do.
Kay, I feel like you read all of our communications materials, because that's exactly what we say.
Yeah, Kay, at the end of the class, I talked to our trainers that we've just recently trained, and I talk about changing the definition, or adding to the definition of courage. If you ask any cop what courage means, it means running towards gunfire, saving someone from a burning building, running down a fleeing suspect. That's courage. Well, now what we're adding to the word is the expectation that you will intervene to stop or mitigate harm, that you will save another officer, you'll save a citizen, you'll save your agency, you'll save your city from the results of that harm.
I think also you need to add is the seriousness of the incident that you're responding to. For police, definitely it's a procedural issue. Just for an example, you respond to a scene, you're the assigned officer, which would be, in our situation, the duty car would respond to any incident at hand. So basically, he's the first investigator that's going to be on the scene. He's going to make some determinations. They may be right, they may be wrong at that time. But if he's going to need some additional supervision, he'll ask for his supervisor or even his partner to come and assist. And together, they should be working as a teamwork. But the original officer is the one that's going to be doing that investigation. If it escalates to the point where there's a death involved, then you're going to request detectives respond. You may get administrators to respond, such as lieutenant, myself, depending upon the seriousness. But we're going to first rely on that first officer at the scene to fill us in on what he has observed, what he's done. And if there's a mistake there, we're going to try to correct it, obviously, depending upon what the nature of the mistake may be. Obviously, when you're dealing with a serious incident, there is a lot of opportunity for a lot of mistakes to happen. And again, this is where you need redundancy in the training. So it becomes second nature to you. Sometimes, you can have the app of a manual with you, or the manual has always been accessible to any officer, but you're not going to have that time to say, hey, could you look this up? Where do I go from here? No, there's not time for that. That's where the training comes in. The redundancy of it becomes second nature. And it, like you said before, it's brain muscle. And the other officers there that are at the scene, if they do suspect something is going awry, they definitely would speak up, hopefully and initially, of what they're seeing is going wrong. And, I've been on a lot of scenes, and I've seen a lot of things unfold. And, I can make a mistake, but I listen to my subordinates who are there saying, no, Chief, I think we need to do it this way. I'm not gonna get into a debate with him on that, because he sees something better that I don't, or I'm missing something right off the top of my head that I should be doing, and he's able to correct it. And that's what it should be, that whole team effort. I agree with all that's been done with the experiments. People are people, and you're dealing with a lot of human nature and how you're going to respond to a lot of this stuff. But for police officers and in nursing field, it's training. How are you going to do your job? And it should be basically done and practiced every day.
Yeah, and it makes a huge difference when you have the leadership of a department saying, I want you to intervene on me if you see me making a mistake, if you see me doing something that I shouldn't be doing. That then gives all of your officers permission, not just to intervene on you individually, but to intervene on anyone of a higher rank, because, hey, if the chief is willing to accept an intervention, then everyone should be.
Everyone can
And that's
speak.
really where that culture piece comes in.
Just imagine if those 3 officers that watched George Floyd die had gone through this training and had the power and had the training to walk over to Derek Chauvin and stop him at some point prior to George Floyd's death, how our world would be different right now.
I do
think
find,
that's a great point, because we look and the primary culprit was a training officer, and the other 2 of them were basically rookies with 2 or less, I think, weeks on the job. So it's empowering them from a very early part of their career to be able to challenge the decision of someone who's superior. And in the process, they would have been doing that officer a favor, because who knows what he is every other day. It doesn't mean that he necessarily had to be, that was indicative of his behavior. And I just want to mention, if you look at Kitty Genovese, which was in the 60s, when she was murdered in Queens, and her whole building, basically a whole building, just watched it happen. Nobody even went to the window and said, hey, stop. So
no one called 911.
So Brett is
didn't have
laughing
911.
because
Nobody.
Oh, here we go. Take it away, Lisa. Go ahead.
talked about in the class why we don't talk about Kitty Genovese, which is because people did call the police. No one called 911 because it hadn't been invented yet. People did call the police. People did call down and stop the assailant. Most of the attack took place in a place where no one could see what was happening. But the important thing is that that story was out there for so many years, is still out there, was only very recently debunked, and a lot of people don't know that.
I never knew that.
Gave rise to this field of active bystandership research.
And isn't that why we have 911?
It is one of the main contributing factors, because it was so difficult for people to figure out who they were supposed to call to get a hold of their police station, to explain what was going on, figure out who needed to be dispatched. Yeah, there's Brett's laughing because I could talk about this for hours, but
She's a bit obsessed. I'll tell you that.
No, I read the article she's talking about, where they interviewed people. People did respond.
Yeah, and it's actually fascinating if you ever care to learn more about it. It shows really a range of responses. There was at least one person who saw it and went, that's none of my business, and went to sleep. But there were people who called the police. There was one person who yelled down at the assailant and actually scared him away. He then came back, unfortunately, and continued what he had started. But there was also a young housewife and mother who ran down the stairs not knowing if the assailant was gone or coming back, and held Katie Genovese in her arms as she lay dying. So that, I think, is such a fascinating case for showing the real range of human responses to it. Unfortunately, it became famous for the thought that this whole neighborhood in Queens, where I used to live, was full of these apathetic bystanders who just watched a woman be murdered. But the fascinating thing about this is, even though that story wasn't true in the way that it was told, it gave rise to this field of research that showed that, yeah, actually having more people around in an emergency can be worse, because everyone assumes, like Brett was talking about with the diffusion of responsibility, someone else is going to act. Okay, yeah, I'm sure, you know what, 30 people have probably called the police by now, so I don't need to call and clog up the phone lines. Everyone else is doing it.
And by the way, the two stories that I shared with you, you see that happen, right? You see there are 5-10 officers there with FTO Mcdonald. Were they all thinking someone else would say something? You have dozens of officers, if not more than dozen, on the homicide scene with Detective Jensen. Were they all expecting someone else to confront him? All of the science works. I will let you know, we will share the link to the Lisa Kurtz, Stanley Milgram, and Kitty Genovese fan
love to
club.
read
She's
that.
starting a fan club.
I knew this
I want to mention,
the first time. I never heard what Lisa was saying.
no, go ahead.
There are a lot of resources that I would be happy to share. We will probably be doing an in-depth look at it for some of our instructors at some point, and I'm sure we could make that available to folks.
I do find that post George Floyd, I've been law enforcement 30 years and it's still active. Now it's not the case where people would, the youngest rookie would tell me, and I've been, like I said, forever, or anyone else to knock it off. And pre George Floyd, I would have never expected that.
Howie, we look about the same age, and I've got similar years. I've got a total of 36 years in law enforcement. I would like to think that's true, but I think we both know it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when the next incident will occur in the United States. And that's why this training.
Oh, it's training's imperative.
This is so important. We need to change the culture of policing.
I'd like to, I'm here as a private citizen, but I'd like to bring what you guys are doing. I've been taking notes to ATF to do it formally.
And you have to wonder, the person who did yell down and got this guy to leave, what would have happened if, instead of just yelling downstairs and saying cut it off, if that person had gone downstairs to see if she was okay? So now maybe this person's not coming back when they see someone else is there. So to what level do we actually engage in the act of bystandership?
She was upright when the guy ran away. So the person who called down thought she was okay.
The dynamic might have changed what happened.
So in addition to training, what do you guys recommend as the best practices for this to actually take hold at a particular department?
So I put in a chat, or actually, Brett, if you don't mind, while I'm talking, putting in the chat the link to our 10 standards page. So as I mentioned, we have these standards that are required. So these are really based on the experience that we had in New Orleans rolling this out over the past 5 or 6 years. The things that we think are necessary to make culture change. So part of it is having policies in place, like I talked about, that protect people who intervene, having those policies that make an intervention a formal mitigating factor in any discipline, having policies in place that require the investigation of any failure to intervene. So if we see an incident where we had officers who could have intervened and didn't, we're going to look into why that happened or why that didn't happen. But we also have, there's a requirement right out of the gate. When any agency is looking to join ABLE, they have to have the support of their chief, or whatever their chief executive's title is, superintendent, commissioner. They have to have the support of their mayor, or, if it's a county, their county executive, whoever that person is. And they have to have the support of at least 2 community groups. And we expect that those community groups will stay involved, that the agency will communicate with the community about what they're doing, and will also view the community as a partner who will be giving feedback and who will be staying abreast of what they're doing with ABLE and how their culture is changing. I'm not going to go through all 10 of the standards because it would be exhaustive, but it's really all about department-wide implementation, about making sure that this becomes a true part of the daily life of officers who are out in the field, of our frontline supervisors, of our top-level command staff, all the way up to the very top of the organization. We want every single officer to both accept interventions, to perform interventions, and to, as Kay so eloquently put it, to expect those interventions. So,
and what kind of evidence triggers like a report? Like, can just a complaint trigger it, or how does that happen? How would you say that happens?
So there's no reporting requirement for interventions. So anything that was reportable before ABLE is still reportable after.
No. What I mean is, if, for example, like there's a civilian that complains about some action and that was never reported, say on the police side, how does that process? How would you see that process going?
So that's up to, I mean, like we said,
That
we don't
doesn't
change the
change.
policies of any department in terms of their investigation. So all of that is going to be the same. The only thing that might potentially change, like I said, is that we require a successful intervention to be a formal mitigating factor. And if there was a failure to intervene, so if we're having folks who are watching body worn camera video, or we have, okay, reports, we know that these other officers were on the scene, why didn't they intervene? And that's going to start an investigation, which isn't necessarily disciplinary. It might be that all of those officers weren't in a position to intervene, but that's something that we're going to look into.
And Jorge, one of the beauties of effective bystander intervention is the stories that will never be told because effective bystandership occurred. That if we intervene early, if we intervene effectively, then that citizen never comes to the station to complain. That lawsuit never gets filed. The media never does that gotcha story on the corruption in your police department because everyone within the police culture has mitigated that or prevented it from happening.
And Brett there was paraphrasing Ted Quant, who's a social activist who has been involved with ABLE, with EPIC from the very beginning. Ted is a guy who, in his own words, has never missed a protest against the police in his life. He was the founding director of the Twomey Center for Peace and Justice at Loyola University in New Orleans. Super anti-police until he learned about EPIC and ABLE, and he is 100% on board, a huge champion for these things. And he's the one who said, actually at a hearing in front of a federal judge overseeing a consent decree for New Orleans, that ABLE is so great because its true measure of success is in all the stories that will never be told. And so we have the support of folks like Ted. We have a civil rights attorney who made her name suing the police, who's a strong supporter of ABLE. We have several NAACP branches and even a local Black Lives Matter branch that have signed on for letters of support for agencies. I think we're maybe the only people who have had a conference that was co-sponsored by the Fraternal Order of Police and the Southern Poverty Law Center. So far, we have not found anyone who dislikes this program. It's really a win-win. It's something, it's good for police, it's good for the community, it's good for bridging that gap between the two and really looking at the police not as a separate and opposing force, but as actually part of the community, as an integral part of the community. And that's what this is really all about.
Is there any extension of this to the community to get them to be more willing to help the police?
We have had a lot of talks about next steps for this. I think right now what we want is for our police to serve as leaders in the community, to demonstrate this active bystandership. That's why we think the communication piece is so important, to say, listen, this is something that we're doing. Here's why we think it is important. And as these leaders in the community, we're going to be the very first ones to go through it. I think it's something at some point, if agencies wanted to bring this out into our communities, we would certainly be open to having those conversations. It's not the focus of ABLE at this point. ABLE is active bystandership for law enforcement. But yes, absolutely. I think that bystandership training can be effective in communities. As we've seen, it's been effective for civilian professions.
Yeah, I tend to agree with what you're saying. I think it's an excellent program. And I think you'll see a lot more interaction as a result of the use of body cams. They're definitely going to be telling the story straight out and straightforward as to what an officer did and what he should have done. Body cams, I think, is going to be an excellent tool as far as future incidents involving best practices.
I think we definitely need body cams.
So Lisa and we have another call at 6 p.m. We're happy to stay and answer any more questions you have. Did we put up the slide yet with our contact information, Lisa?
I will do that right now. In the last few minutes that we have, we'll throw that up there so y'all can get in touch with us.
This was excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank y'all for having us. We're always more than happy to share ABLE with anyone who's interested.
Thank you for your help.
So here's
and thank you to Vanessa for making it happen for us.
Yes, thank you so much to Vanessa and to our partners at MasterCard for making things like this possible. We really couldn't do any of this without y'all.
Absolutely. And I have to say, we have MasterCard as just, what a phenomenal corporate citizen that we have to support this. And I don't think we got into this portion of it, but generally there's no cost for ABLE because MasterCard, along with some other corporate sponsors, pick up the tab there. So it's more than, it's tremendous. They put their time in and they're working with us in terms of the time and becoming extremely proficient in terms of what Able does themselves, but they're also really investing in the community. And I think we have to highlight that when we see that that happens.
Absolutely.
So-
Yeah, that's a great thing to bring up. Thank you.
Does ABLE do training for the police departments? Do you go into the police departments and sort of do role playing?
So it's a train the trainer model. So agencies that are accepted send us instructors. We think that this comes a lot better from folks who are actually within the department, from officers that people know and have relationships with and know that they're, these leaders within the department. So we train the instructors, and then the instructors go back and give the training to every single commissioned person, from the chief on down to the rookie to the academy folks. So every single person in the department will get the training.
But Kay, we are not naive to think that we can just send them off their merry way. In the future, we hope to have quality assurance where someone like me and other people with ABLE drop in at training sessions to make sure it's being done. We're going to be doing surveys and the research that we talked to you about earlier on, so that we're going to know whether or not they're teaching the points and the way we want it taught.
All right, so I think we have to hop off now. Thank you so much again to everyone for being on this. Thank you to Mayo. Thank you to Vanessa. Brett, thanks for doing this with me. This has been so great. We really appreciate all of your time, and please be in touch with any questions or thoughts.
We truly appreciate
Thank you very
you.
much.
Thank
you both.
you, everyone. This
I'm
is
gonna reach out to you.
great. Thank you.
It's our
Thank
pleasure.
you, Abel.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Make sure we put this on our agenda to get it as one of our recommendations at the next meeting, and really quickly, because I think all of us that were on this were in agreement on it. So, I mean, just fast track it.
Well, it sounds great to me. I thought it was.
Can't hear you.
Have further come about it, and it's hard. If anybody has any comments or questions or observations, by all means, we'll discuss it further. But I'm glad that we were able to hear the presentation. And in my estimation, at least, it seems like it provides a lot of positives.
Yes.
Yeah, it was excellent.
I think that was a good suggestion that John made. The next meeting for group 1 is on Monday from 5 to 7, and the next meeting for group 2 is on Wednesday from 2 to 4. So we could have this as the first topic just while it's fresh, and then we could hopefully have the recommendation.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All righty. Have a good night.
Everyone,
Good night.
have a nice weekend.
Good night.
Absolutely.